Hello and welcome to part 1 of Whys of History number 7, where we've pretty much used up all of our relevant Credence and Big Lebowski jokes by this point in the series. Way to go, Donnie. Oh wait, no, now we've used them up. This next set is going to look at the Vietnam War in the 20th century, seeking to understand what exactly it was that dragged the United States into one of the longest and most deadly conflicts in its history. Now, normally I don't much bother with American history, that's kind of Sam's thing, but I figured this would be a great learning experience for me as well as all of you at home. Now, part 1 here is going to look at the circumstances that actually drove the US to war, and part 2 over there is going to look at the reasoning behind why the US went to war and how it changed as the war went on. But before we dive too far into this quagmire, let's hit our
randomly relevant random word
for this episode, sunk cost.
That's clearly 2 words. Thank God this isn't a show about math.
Hey Sam, here's 2 words for you. Shut up. So when someone talks about the sunk cost fallacy or theory, they're usually referring to the concept in business and economics that rational businessmen or consumers shouldn't let their decisions be influenced by money or time or resources that they've already spent or sunk and cannot get back. As a real-world example, back in college I went and saw Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 at midnight on a Thursday with a case of the flu that was so bad that Deathly Hallows could have described the state of my health. On that fateful night, I spent over 2 hours waiting in line for a over 2-hour long movie, all with a 100-degree fever that required a veritable Ho Chi Minh Trail of tissues and water. Why, by Dumbledore's beard, did I suffer through this? At first, I went because I'd already bought and paid for the ticket, despite the fact that I wasn't even remotely healthy enough to go. And then, once I got to the theater, I never left because I'd toughed out so much of the wait at that point that it would be silly to leave. Both the money I'd spent on the ticket and the time spent sitting in line were sunk costs. There was no way I was ever getting them back, and yet my emotional connection to the fact that I'd already spent them meant I never bothered to make the logical decision, which was to go the hell home and sleep. As an added bonus, the chunks of the movie I didn't end up sleeping through I hardly remembered from all the fever and medication, so a week later I went and saw it again. Bringing us back on topic, wars and conflicts like Vietnam are often noted as prime examples of the sunk cost theory at work. Even when the war appeared bleak for the United States, when public unhappiness with the war was at its peak, there was a permeating national sense that accepting defeat meant forfeiting the lives and money already spent in the conflict, ignoring the fact that those lives and dollars were already gone and were never coming back. Part 1. Context, context, context. Before we jump right into the context of American involvement in Vietnam, let's do the Vietnamese some justice and talk about the history of Vietnam itself, which heavily influenced the context that drew the US to war in 1964. Luckily, much of Vietnamese history focuses on a single theme: foreign intervention and independence. Going back almost 2,000 years, the nation known as Vietnam, and in particular the northern end of the country, was ruled by China and would be on and off for almost 1,000 years. Vietnam's long Pacific coastline served as the midway point between India and China, and the nation was a valuable Chinese territory. The long period of occupation saw a lot of Chinese intervention in Vietnam in the form of Chinese settlers, Chinese language, and Chinese culture and technologies like rice farming, leaving a strong Chinese impression on Vietnamese culture while simultaneously alienating a lot of ethnically Vietnamese people. This led to a very tumultuous relationship, with multiple periods of revolt and revolution by the Vietnamese against China. Ultimately, Chinese domination would be overthrown for good, more or less, with General No Quyen in 938 CE, leading to a long period of independence that saw the introduction of Buddhism, the defense of Vietnam from outsiders like the Mongols, and even the name Vietnam. While many years of prosperity and harmony followed independence, by the 1600s Vietnam was fractured along north and south, and internal divisions and civil wars threatened to rip the nation in two. In 1802, after a series of rebellions and civil wars between North and South, Vietnam was finally united once again under the Nguyen dynasty. However, by this point, European powers had made lots of headway into Southeast Asia, particularly through Catholic missionaries that were originally brought over by the Portuguese in the 1500s, but by this point were sponsored by everyone's favorite silver medal empire creators, the French. The new Nguyen dynasty sought to return Vietnam to its Confucian roots, and the emperors became increasingly hostile to the Catholic presence in the country. This hostility towards Catholic missionaries eventually provided the pretext for a French attack and invasion in 1847, followed by the complete annexation of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia into the French Indochina Union in 1887. Like under their Chinese overlord 1,000 years before, the Vietnamese resented and covertly resisted the brutal French occupation, which centered around rubber harvesting and production. When France fell to Nazi Germany in World War II, Vietnam was basically handed to Japan, and by the end of the war, Vietnam had suffered immense losses in the struggle against Japanese occupation. It was during this period that Ho Chi Minh, a huge player in the Vietnam War and the eventual leader of North Vietnam, began to build a communist movement in Vietnam that was focused on national unity and independence. His organization was called the League for the Independence of Vietnam, but was better known as the Viet Minh, and by the end of World War II, they controlled considerable amounts of territory and support in the country. With the end of World War II, France, bolstered by Marshall Plan money from the United States, sought to re-establish its control over Indochina, and this would result in 8 years of horrific fighting between France and Ho Chi Minh's guerrilla forces. Despite heavy backing from the United States, France was unable to beat back the Viet Minh, and after the French's legendary defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the French backed out of Vietnam in 1954, signaling the end of French control over Southeastern Asia and the end of any conflict whatsoever in Vietnam. Thank you very much for watching.
Whoa. What about the other Vietnam War?
What other Vietnam War? Vietnam War. Oh my. So, after some quick Googling, I've discovered that the Geneva Accords that ended the war didn't actually end all conflict in Vietnam. The Accords called for a splitting of Vietnam into North and South along the 17th parallel, with a communist-ish state under Ho Chi Minh established in the north, and a non-communist-ish state in the south under Catholic dictator Ngo Dinh. As per the Geneva Accords, nationwide elections were to be held in 1956 to unify the country. Having resisted Chinese control, French control, Japanese control, and French control again, it seemed that the Vietnamese had finally won their unity and independence, though to be fair, there was still a distinct divide between communists and non-communists and Catholics and non-Catholics. While the French had given up on controlling Vietnam, the United States hadn't, and the political, military, and financial aid that the United States had given to the French during the war was transferred to the South Vietnamese government. The United States feared that Ho Chi Minh and his northern communists would win an overwhelming victory in the 1956 elections, so the elections simply never happened, and in 1959 the North sought to unify the nation by force. The South Vietnamese government, corrupt, very unpopular, and extremely reliant on the United States, quickly became overwhelmed as Vietnamese people across the country took up arms with the Viet Minh, now called the National Liberation Front. The Diem government began repressive crackdowns in an attempt to retain power, which just further isolated it from the Vietnamese people and the United States, and in 1963 Diem was overthrown in a US-backed military coup. It's at this point that American intervention begins to ramp up to the point that most people, myself apparently excluded, are familiar with. So why did the United States do it? By 1964, the situation seemed inevitable. Vietnam had a long history of beating back foreign invaders, Ho Chi Minh had just proven he could defeat a Western power through sustained guerrilla warfare, and the Southern Vietnamese government was widely ineffective and overwhelmed by internal and external unrest. The biggest reason the US did it, at least openly stated, was the idea of containment and the domino theory. But in order to understand that, we need to go way back to like the founding of American foreign policy. As it was Washington in 17...
Whoa, we're already filming an episode. Let's not start another one here.
No, Sam, but this will only take a minute. It's important context. So following the end of World War II, it seemed that the whole world was dividing into two different factions. Communist countries allied with the USSR, and non-communist countries allied with the United States. And while the United States and non-communism would ultimately win out, the 1950s and 60s were utterly defined by the Cold War, and every country that hadn't picked a side was seen as a battleground between the two factions. The idea of the domino theory stated that if one country fell to communism, then the others around it would do so as well, setting off a chain of communist uprisings that would challenge the capability of the United States and its allies, as as well as close the vital markets and raw materials that the United States and its capitalist system relied on. Containment was the policy of intervening to prevent communist uprisings, therefore containing communism to as few countries as possible. This doctrine provided the justification for war in Korea, and this would be the justification for entering Vietnam as well. If Vietnam fell to communism, many argued, then so too would the rest of Indochina, threatening India and Australia and Japan and possibly the whole of Asia. The idea of preventing Ho Chi Minh and his communist Viet Minh from turning Vietnam into a communist state pervaded government thought and rationality, both publicly and privately. The United States, as the beacon of anti-communism, felt it needed to make a stand in Asia to show the communist world that it would not simply roll over and allow communism to take hold wherever there were communist movements, like as was seen in China in 1948. Let's not forget the sunk cost theory here as well. By 1964, the United States had been throwing money and support at the South Vietnamese government for almost a decade, and a crushing northern victory would have amounted to a lot of sunk resources on top of the global embarrassment. So despite the seemingly inevitable defeat of American interests in Vietnam, the American public in the early 1960s remained wary of an aggressive strategy, if they even knew anything about Vietnam to begin with. However, the US soon found a definitive and seemingly not aggressive pretext for war. In early August of 1964, two American destroyers off the coast of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin claimed they were attacked without provocation by Northern forces, seemingly demonstrating an act of aggression by North Vietnam against the United States directly. Despite a lot of uncertainty surrounding the legitimacy of this attack, American President Lyndon Johnson used the incident to push for direct American retaliation. This led to the passing of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution by Congress, giving the president essentially unlimited authority to defend Southeast Asia, and in particular Vietnam, from communist threats. Perhaps unsurprisingly, historians now view the Gulf of Tonkin attack as based on extremely faulty evidence at best and completely fabricated at worst. With containment in mind and the Gulf of Tonkin incident rallying American support, President Johnson dramatically expanded American involvement in Vietnam, arguing that it was necessary to beat back communism in Asia and protect the South Vietnamese from a communist threat. A massive bombing raid of the North soon followed, and by 1967 there were over 500,000 American troops on the ground in Vietnam. However, as the war dragged on, the idea of stopping communism and retaliating against the North held less sway with fewer people, and the justification for the war would have to change and adapt to a changing battlefield and increasingly disillusioned population. But more about that next time. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to see part 2, whenever it's ready, it'll be right over there. Thank you very much. I am Professor Jordan, and we'll see you all next class. Like rice farming. Uh-oh. Trouble with the capital. Oh, we took away his spot to get up on the... Excuse you. No, get out of here. Cat. No. Come here. No, don't sit down. Oh my god. Don't scratch yourself.
Okay, here he goes.
Tokyo. Oh wait, you're not the dog. Okay, you've sniffed all this before. Come here. Come here. Yes, let's go. CE, leading to a long period of independence. Cat, get out of here!